Now, you hear a lot of people talking about sex and gender identity these days, but have you ever wondered what people in the ancient biblical world thought about sex and gender? That was the topic of a talk I gave here at Rock Valley College back in April, and I wanted to share it with you. Now, that talk was almost an hour long, so I'm going to split it up into 3 parts. The first part looks at how sex and gender were understood in the ancient biblical world. The second video will look at how the gods, including Yahweh, the God of Israel, could violate gender norms without any loss of honor. In the third video, we'll look at evidence that first century Christians subverted Greco-Roman gender norms and at some of the negative reactions from their Roman neighbors. So let's ask a few critical questions on this episode of Sounds Like BS, Sex and Gender in the Ancient Biblical World. Well, thanks, Terry, for the introduction and for letting me share what I'm working on here with the Rock Valley College community. Before I begin, I know this is in Florida, but since some people are now prone to view statues of even biblical figures like David as pornography, I just want to point out that we are going to be talking about sex and gender. I will be showing photos of paintings and statues that do depict human bodies in various states of undress. I assume we all are adults with human bodies, so nothing should be very surprising, but I just thought I'd give you a heads up. Biblical texts are ancient, thousands of years old. So if we come across some unfamiliar ideas in them, we shouldn't be too surprised any more than we would be shocked if we came across some strange ideas in Homer's Odyssey or Hesiod's Theogony. People generally saw the world differently back then. This cultural distance can be difficult to accept, though, in more familiar texts like those in the Bible, and especially regarding a topic like sex and gender, because the texts so often seem to reach the same conclusions that we might. So someone's a king and he's a man. Somebody gives birth and she's a woman, and you're like, yeah, that's what I would have thought. But here's the thing. 2 people can reach the same conclusion while thinking about the topic in completely different ways. Let me give you an example. Say I want to go watch the sunset tonight. Evidently not. But let's say I wanted to go watch the sunset tonight and I could see the sun. I will look to the west. And if my daughter asks me, why does the sun set in the west? I will tell her a story about how the earth rotates in an easterly direction, so west is sort of the direction of us turning away from the sun. Now, if an ancient Greek wanted to watch the sunset, she would also look to the west. We reach the same conclusion. But if her daughter asked her, why does the sun set in the west? She would tell her a story about the god Helios or Apollo streaking across the sky in his fiery chariot. So yeah, we reach the same conclusion, but we do it through completely different modes of reasoning. The same could be said for how ancient people thought about sex and gender. Yeah, they often reach similar conclusions to what some modern people might, but they reach those conclusions through a dramatically different way of understanding gender than we see today. To unpack these differences a bit, I'm going to first look at the modern binary paradigm of sex and gender that some people use. I don't mean this as an endorsement of binary gender ideas, but we can use them as a familiar point of comparison. The binary paradigm wants gender to have only 2 options, men and women. Like ones and zeros in a binary number, see, I had to work in the math. There's never ambiguity about which a person is, and you can't change from one to the other. Now, to accomplish this, the paradigm imagines a 2-track chain of causes that's binary at every step and starts at conception with genes. Remember that. Genes are fundamental to fully developed binary thinking. Once you're on a track, you can't leave it. Because of your genes, you develop certain genitals. Because of your genitals, you have a certain body type. Because of your body, including your brain in some versions of this paradigm, you behave a certain way. And lastly, almost incidentally, you have the gender identity you have because of all of the above. Now, this paradigm has been challenged in recent decades, so defenders of the binary model make 2 additional meta-claims. First, they're just describing sex and gender the way they actually work. This is just how the world is. So it's not a paradigm, it's not normative. They're just describing things. And second, that people have always thought this way, including and especially in the biblical world. Critics of the binary model highlight problems in the first claim that this is just the way it is. Looking closely at how sex and gender empirically work shows that there are hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people who simply do not fit the model. With so many exceptions at every step of gender realization, it's clear that the model is not purely descriptive. It doesn't describe how gender always works, but normative. It describes how gender ought to work from a certain perspective. There are problems in the second claim, too, that people have always thought the way they do. In fact, if we consider this model for just a moment, it should become obvious that ancient Mediterranean people could not agree on every point. For example, the binary model begins with genes. It's the foundation of the model. Yet the correlation between genes and gender wasn't discovered until 1905. That's last century. The youngest texts in the Bible are 19 centuries old. This discovery is barely one. Genes and DNA are some far-off future Star Trek sci-fi nonsense to somebody in the ancient world. So before last century, genes weren't part of the discussion as far as anyone knew. There's no real mechanism to make us male or female from conception. They thought biological sex was a result of later environmental factors. We'll get to those in a moment. Genitals also play an incredibly important role in binary thinking in a way that other markers don't. Look, people who identify as men, on average, have more muscular development in their arms than women. But men and women both have arms. In fact, some women have very well-developed muscles in their arms, and some men don't. There's no absolute difference between men's arms and women's. They're not different anatomical structures. They just show tendencies toward different levels of muscular development, much of which can be chalked up to behavior more than anatomy. But genitals are completely different organs made up of different tissues and cells. In binary thought, they're the one physical sign that men and women are, in some sense, distinct organisms. But this wasn't the case before modern anatomical studies. We can only see cells under a microscope, which wasn't invented until a few centuries ago. So no one had any sense that cells were a thing. When they talk about sperma, they're not talking about sperm cells. Of course, they saw the different organs, but how would they interpret those differences in ancient biology? In what Thomas Laqueur calls a one-sex model, men's and women's genitals were more like masculine and feminine arms. There's no fundamental difference. One set just tends to be more developed than the other. What I mean is this. An embryo is asexual at conception, basically a batter of semen and menstrual fluid that needs to be baked into a human. A bun in the oven is a very ancient metaphor. So only by applying the proper amount of heat and wind, or pneuma, in the womb, could women's genitals become men's genitals. According to ancient Western anatomical thinking, the penis was simply a vagina turned outward, the scrotum an externalized uterus, and the testicles the same as ovaries. They even used the same word for ovaries and testicles, since the only difference they saw was their location. Ideally, a child would look and act just like its father. But if the man infused his semen with too little wind or spirit during sex, or if the woman's womb were too cold, the baby would fail to look like its father, becoming a girl instead. Men's genitals were what all genitals were supposed to look like. It's just that some are underdeveloped. Gestation is often imperfect, and one of the most common imperfections, according to ancient biology, is a girl. So sex doesn't describe two wholly distinct complementary categories, but places on a vertical spectrum with male a label for fully developed, fully perfected humans at the top. Females were underdeveloped, imperfect humans at the bottom. And if that sounds misogynistic to you, well, you're not wrong. Jesus and his followers sometimes teach about becoming perfect, and in one ancient Christian text that takes in an explicitly sex dimension. In the Gospel of Thomas, an early Christian book that didn't make it into Bibles, the chief disciple, Peter, wants another disciple, Mary, to leave while Jesus teaches them, since according to Peter, women are not worthy of life. They're imperfect. They don't deserve eternal life. Jesus disagrees, saying, I will lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit, just like you men will. Since every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, we only found this text a few decades ago, so it confused a lot of scholars, but Marvin Meyer highlights that it makes sense in the context of ancient biology. Peter shouldn't worry because Jesus will perfect Mary. And a natural step on Mary's way to becoming a perfect living spirit is to become a perfect body, which in ancient Greek thought was male. The saying presumes that all it would take is the proper infusion of heat and spirit to transition Mary from a woman to a man. Similarly, in another early Christian text, in the martyr story of a 2nd century woman named Perpetua, before she's forced into the arena, God gives her a vision of herself stripped naked and bodily transitioned into a man. According to this Christian text, the truth is that God has made her male. At a spiritual level, she is a man, whether her Roman persecutors recognize it or not. So, genes weren't a thing for ancient people, and genitals were just another aspect of the body, not their own category. With a one-sex mentality, gender has to carry more of the load. In this ancient model, the relationship between body, behavior, and identity is not causal, but mutually influential. Now, it may seem natural to some to say that body and behavior influence identity, but how do behavior and identity influence the body? Diana Swancutt highlights Roman discussions of how women who behaved like men made their bodies more masculine, and I don't mean just more muscular. Here it's worth taking a moment to highlight the bodily characteristics ancient people thought determined a masculine body. In our culture, people bring up things like height or hairiness or muscular strength as masculine features. In the ancient world, there were 4 distinctly masculine qualities a man's body would have. Men's bodies were hot, hard, dry, and penetrating, whether in sex with a penis or on the battlefield with a weapon. Women's bodies simply lacked these qualities. They were considered cold, soft, moist, and penetrable, especially during sex. So how might behavior change bodies? Well, the Roman Seneca complains of women who eat, drink, wrestle, and even have sex like men, which means penetrating others in some way. As a result, he claims these women have developed male pattern baldness and gout, a disease more commonly found in men. Their bodies reflect their masculine behavior. I mean, if the statue is accurate, it looks like he's projecting, but we'll get on to Marshall. Marshall, meanwhile, describes a woman named Bassa who has so much sex with women that he comments on her, quote, monstrous penis, poetically suggesting that even Bassa's genitals are becoming male, that is, capable of being hard and penetrating as a result of her masculine behavior. Meanwhile, men who acted like women were considered soft like a woman, not just by becoming less toned, but also in their sexual impotence. Hardness was considered a masculine quality. In the Roman way of thinking, a man who behaved like a woman, which included having too much compassion for his wife and children, or even just eating too much food, couldn't get an erection, and he certainly couldn't father male children. So for women and men, behavior could influence the body. And in their way of thinking, a person also needed to know their place, to have the proper gender identity in order to behave the right way according to gender norms. Ovid tells the story of Iphis, whose father wanted a son. So he told his pregnant wife to kill the child if it were born a girl. When the baby went and had a vagina anyway, Iphis' mother just said she had a boy rather than kill the kid. Iphis was raised as a boy, so given a masculine identity. Because his identity was masculine, he played like a boy, learned like a boy, and because he behaved like a boy, he grew up tall and handsome with no noticeable breasts like any boy might. His identity guided his development, not vice versa. From his actions and looks, no one had any clue that Iphis had a vagina. He was a man. He was even engaged to a woman, but knew it wasn't quite within his power to impregnate her. So the god Isis favored Iphis and transitioned him into an anatomical man, with no noticeable effect on his body except pushing his genitals to the outside, and it had no impact at all on his behavior or identity. Basically, no one noticed except Iphis and his mom, because she was there. Like Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas, to Isis, having a vagina is a single imperfection. In Iphis' realization of masculinity, one easily solved by an infusion of wind. Despite allowing for fluidity in gender, Greco-Roman and Israelite cultures strongly discriminated between men and women in their ethics. If they thought gender was so fluid, why all the different rules for men and women? It's a very complex question, but we can look at 3 common reasons for this. One has to do with fertility. Ancient biology recognized that intersex people, that is, people whose genes, genitals, and hormones don't align in a binary manner, although they wouldn't have phrased it that way, are often infertile. So they wrongly concluded that any tendency toward the middle, especially by men, caused infertility. Since they recognized that gender identity and behavior influence their bodies, ancient ethics pushed gender to the extremes to ensure citizens had lots of babies. Otherwise, Greco-Roman and Israelite ethics aren't completely distinct, but emphases do shift between them. In Israelite society, fertility and the similarity of men and women are precisely the problem. Christian and Jewish binary thinkers anchor their ideology in the creation stories in Genesis 1 and 2, but let's take a closer look. In the first creation story, Genesis claims God created the human in his image. He created them in God's image. He created them male and female. Genesis underlines that in its view, both men and women are created in God's image. In fact, that's basically all the text tells us about biological sex here, that it doesn't matter. Either way, a person is created in God's image. It doesn't add, but only boys have peepees. Instead, the similarities of men and women is what the text highlights, not any inherent differences. In the second story, God creates Adam first, separately from Eve. From a binary perspective, this detail firmly differentiates men from women. Of course, we could note in passing that the human, the Adam, is not actually gendered until the end of the story when Eve is created, which led more than a few ancient interpreters to read the first human as androgynous, both male and female, until God separates them by pulling the woman out. But even on a more common reading was a man from the start, only the similarities between Adam and Eve are underlined. When Adam sees Eve for the first time, this is all he says. This one, at last, is bone of my bone, and flesh of my flesh. This one will be called woman, Isha, since she was taken out of a man, Ish. Unlike the many animals God creates before Eve, the woman is just like him. Same bone, same flesh. Adam doesn't point at Eve's boobs and yell, "What are those? And where is her wiener?" Instead, he only comments on how much Eve is like him. But oddly enough, that's why rules are needed. The Israelite laws in the Torah, for example, tell people not to sow two different plants in one field. That is, to separate two similar things, or chaos ensues. Ancient Israelite gender norms also separate two similar things, men and women. Most of the gendered rules in the Torah can be traced back to men's insecurity about raising children who aren't their own. There are no paternity tests in the ancient world. So rules regarding how women dress, where they can go without an escort, and obviously who they can have sex with, all serve to make it difficult to get pregnant by the wrong man. When men doubted that a child was theirs, they tended to get emotional, hysterical even. But the problem was sometimes when they got emotional, sometimes people died. To maintain peace and order, Israelite society's solution was to separate men from women more and more strictly over time. So gendered behavioral norms increased fertility in their view, but that effect was tempered by rules that created separate social and physical spaces for men and women, which prevented unwanted pregnancies and the social disorder they caused. Meanwhile, in Greco-Roman culture, upper-class women had more economic freedom than Israelite women. They could get an education and could inherit and manage their own money, for example. In the first century, though, women were proving to be smart and competent at running family businesses, even influencing politics. The rise of women threatened to overturn social hierarchies. The deserving, accomplished, perfect men might have to answer to some imperfect woman. Greco-Roman gender norms kept that from happening. These norms kept one group, men, and specifically a small minority group, free-born citizen men, on the top of the social ladder. So on the one hand, the common paradigm of gender in the ancient Mediterranean world recognized that gender could be quite fluid. On the other hand, ancient gender norms were very often strict. Anyone who violated these norms was shamed and dishonored because they were viewed as a threat to the greater society. Well, there was one group who could violate gender norms without any loss of honor: the gods. And yes, this includes Yahweh, the God of ancient Israel. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion of sex and gender in the ancient biblical world, and check out part 2 on gender and the gods.